here's my take. Of Donald Trump's recent announcements, the one that intrigues, even excites me the most, is the establishment of Doge, the misnamed Department of Government Efficiency. Misnamed because it is really a non-governmental advisory body that will work with the White House, not any kind of department inside government. Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who will be in charge of Doge, are both brilliant, and the federal government has clearly become too expansive and it's too cumbersome. There are over 180,000 pages of federal regulations. Surely it's worth taking a close look at them and retiring many. Observers have pointed out that the duo's efforts will be much harder to achieve than they imagine. Washington may be quite inefficient, but most of what it does is write checks with great efficiency. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, and other mandatory programs make up around 60% of the federal budget. Donald Trump has often said he would protect most of this spending. Next is the Department of Defense at over $800 billion, which has generally been considered untouchable for political reasons, though it is probably the department that most desperately needs to be streamlined. America has 4 different air forces: the Air Force itself, the Army's Air Force, the Navy's Air Force, and that of the Marines. After the Pentagon comes interest on the debt, also untouchable, which is almost as large as the Pentagon's budget. What is now left is about 15% of the federal budget, which includes certain veterans' benefits, agricultural subsidies, spending on roads and highways, etc. To achieve the $2 trillion spending cuts that Musk has often talked about, he would need to eliminate all of this spending and all of the Pentagon spending, and then he'd still have work to do. But I do support the impulse to reform, and not just because I think it will force greater scrutiny and efficiency to government, which needs it. The duo will also force the country, and especially the Republican Party, to confront a reality that it has danced around for decades. The modern Republican Party was forged in opposition to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Ever since the 1930s, the party's strongest ideologues have promised to repeal the New Deal and dismantle the architecture of the federal government that was largely constructed by FDR. But they never did. The first Republican president to occupy the White House after FDR and Truman was Dwight Eisenhower, who largely accepted Roosevelt's legacy. Next, in 1968, came Richard Nixon, who actually expanded it, establishing new agencies like the EPA and proposing a version of universal health care, believe it or not. All this infuriated conservatives who kept urging rollback. Ronald Reagan came to political prominence in a nationally televised speech he made on Barry Goldwater's behalf against a growing government and deeply skeptical of farm subsidies and programs like Medicare and Social Security, warning of socialism that would doom the American Republic to a future of tyranny and unfreedom. But of course, during his 2 terms in office, Reagan never seriously tried to repeal Social Security or Medicare. In fact, federal debt held by the public as a percentage of GDP grew under Reagan. It's worth noting that the only president to balance the budget since 1969 was Bill Clinton. Ramaswamy and Musk have both taken to posting a clip of economist Milton Friedman on their social media, in which he argues for a very limited role for the federal government. Ironically, this role would not seem to envision any support for things like EVs and civilian space programs, which have helped create the bulk of Elon Musk's fortune. But what decades of public policy seem to have revealed is that Friedman's vision has little support in the U.S. We are where we are because the American public has voted for Republican levels of taxation and Democratic levels of spending, which leaves a gap that can only be filled by borrowing. There's a strong argument that the U.S. debt is on an unsustainable path, especially when you consider the rising costs that will come as more and more baby boomers retire. But slashing federal spending dramatically will almost certainly cause an economic downturn. Recall Europe's experiment with austerity in the 2010s. The central lesson of macroeconomic policy in recent decades has been that government spending now constitutes a large enough part of the economy that cutting it drastically can lead to a downward spiral of reduced consumer spending and declining confidence. Your expenditure is my income. The US federal government is smaller than much of the industrialized world in terms of spending as a percentage of GDP. It still desperately needs reform and streamlining. But conservatives have long argued that it needs to be much, much smaller. In fact, a good part of the rage that has built up among parts of the Republican base over decades has been centered on the notion that party leaders have promised repeal again and again, but never delivered. With Doge, we may finally get an effort to actually deliver on the central Republican promise of the last 70 years. And we will find out what America thinks of it.